My wife told me that she wants me to make her a valet stand for our bedroom. To be honest, I had no idea what that was, so I asked her to make a sketch of what she had in mind so I'd have something to go off of. Well, she gave me this. My wife drew this. Not Skeeter, the local meth head. My wife drew this. But in fairness, she knew it wasn't a good drawing, so she wrote next to it, "But make it pretty." Well, I did my best, and I drew this up in Fusion 360. It's pretty fancy looking, but I think it fits the bill. It's got a place for her to hang up a jacket, a rod in front to drape her pair of pants over, and a shelf to put a shirt on. There's a drawer that can be used for undergarments and even a little tray inside for jewelry. Now, I plan to use finger joints for the entire drawer cabinet, and I think that'll look really cool, but the thing that'll really catch your eye will be all the bent slats in the sides. Well, this will definitely be a challenging build, and admittedly, it's out of my comfort zone, which is good. I need to keep pushing myself if I ever want to get better. So, let's see how I do. The first step was to raid my lumber stash and pull out some pieces that'll be good for this project. I'd need a big thick piece for the base of the valet stand, and I'll take it out of this slab. Then everything else can come out of a variety of boards, which I found just sitting around doing nothing in my neighbor's shed. Once the boards were rough cut to length, I could start to jam them through the planer to get them flat. Since the boards weren't too warped and twisted, I could get away with just repeatedly skip planing each side. I just took thin passes and I flipped the board over after each one until eventually they were all flat. After the planer, I took them to the joiner to square up one edge. I just referenced one of the good flat sides against the fence of the joiner and cut in a perfectly flat edge. And at that point, I had a stack of boards with 3 good sides on each. From there, I took them to the table saw and I cut each one out to width. I found 2 pieces that would work well for the base, and I drew on some lines where I wanted them to meet up. And as my wife will attest to, a really good pickup line is imperative to make the 2 meet up together perfectly. A little bit of sanding after it's dry, and then I can use my crosscut sled on the table saw to square it up and get it to its final dimensions. Next, I needed to glue up some panels that'll be the top and the bottom of the drawer cabinet. I found some good looking pieces and then I popped those in the clamps and squared them up afterwards. Alright, now for the fun part. This is my box joint jig that I designed years ago, and it works awesome. I have a few table saw jig videos that'll cover all the different ones that I've made, but this has got to be my favorite. Basically, here's how it works. Once you have things lined up and clamped to the back fence, you can make your first cut. Then, you can nudge the top fence over so that you can cut out the remainder of the gap. And once you have it cut out all the way, you simply lift up the upper fence and move it over so that you can cut the next gap. See, there's a template in the back that's attached to the upper fence, and a small indexing tab that sticks into the gaps. Since this tab is exactly the same width as your saw blade, it controls how much material gets removed for each cut. So I can just work my way down the template, cutting out all the fingers for the joint. Once done, I could flip the 2 pieces over and do the other side. Then once the top and the bottom were done, I could do the sides. But for these, I had to offset the first cut by the width of the gap in the template. Once I had that done, all the rest of the cuts were just like the others. It may seem like a tricky jig to use, but it's really not once you try it. And the cool thing is, you can put other templates on the back and make larger or smaller finger joints. Now the glue up was a little tedious because I had to spread the glue within each of the little gaps. So it's important to use a glue with a long open time, like Titebond 3. Then once I had the pieces fitted together, I could use some clamps to squeeze them even tighter to make sure that the fingers were fully seated into the gaps. And once I had it looking good, I could pop the clamps back off and then check for square. I repeated the process for the other side, and then I let the piece dry. And once it had, I was ready to put on the top. I applied glue to the whole thing, and then I could drop on the last piece and work it into position. And again, I used clamps to send it home, and I made sure everything was square, and then I left it to dry. And once it had, I took it to the router table, and I gave the finger joints a round over. Next, I invited Charlie Sheen over to show me how to do this part correctly. Basically, I took some real fine walnut dust and I mixed it with some glue to form a paste. Then I just mashed it in any visible gaps along the finger joints to fill and hide them. This really worked quite well, and it made the small imperfections completely disappear. Okay, with the cabinet pretty much done, I could start on making the drawer that'll go inside. And since I'm being extra fancy on this project, I decided to use some thin walnut strips to hide the edges of the plywood. I glued them onto the edges, and then I clamped them together until they were dry. Once they had, I just used my block plane to remove the excess material to even them out. Then I cut a small dado into each piece that was just wide enough for the bottom to slide into. And once I had it all fitting good, I trimmed the bottom to fit, and then I could assemble the drawer box. Now, I didn't do anything special here, just butt joints, glue, and some brad nails. But before I put on the fourth side, I could insert the bottom panel into the dado. And once it was fully seated in there, I could dab on a little bit of glue and then fasten on the last piece. Then I glued on a couple of tiny runners onto the inner sides of the drawer so that I could add a small tray that can slide forward and backward. There will be more on that later. The next order of business was to get the drawer slides in. I spaced it up and I used my calipers to set it back the right amount, and then I could drill and screw it into place. For the rails, I just drew a line down the sides of the drawer box and then spotted them through the mounting holes. I put in a couple of screws, made sure it was flush to the front of the drawer box, and then tightened them up and fastened it on. And now for a test fit. Nice. To do the drawer face, I covered the surfaces with blue painter's tape and used some CA glue to temporarily fasten it into place. I just dropped it on and centered it by eye and let the glue dry. Once it had, I tipped the cabinet down, removed the drawer, and took out the little spacer I used to hold things out. Then I could put the drawer back in and drill some mounting holes. At this point, I could pry off the drawer face and remove all the tape and then use the holes to line things back up again and to mount it on. And of course, for this, I had to use some flathead screws. Now for the drawer pull. I wanted to make something unique. I cut down a piece of curly maple and I used a cove bit in the router table to cut in a spot for some fingers to grab onto. Next, I cut out the shape I designed and I just used some spray adhesive to glue it right onto the piece. Then over at the miter saw, I could cut off the ends and I could trim it down to size. At the belt sander, I could shape those sides and work my way up to the line on the stencil. I was sort of going for the shape of a typical coat hanger, but upside down. I figured this might mirror the actual coat hanger that I'm going to be adding later. A little bit of hand sanding and it was ready to be glued on. I skimmed on a thin coat, centered it on the drawer face, and then I weighted it down with one of the kidney stones that I passed long ago. Now to put on the back of the cabinet, I decided to use this rabbiting bit in my trim router to carve in a ledge around the perimeter of the enclosure. Each time I went around, I just increased the depth a little bit until eventually it matched the thickness of the back. Then instead of squaring up the corners with chisels, I thought it would match the roundover of the cabinet better if I rounded the corners of the back piece instead. So I used a compass and I drew on matching curves onto the back piece, and I sanded up to those lines over at the belt sander. I just kept making little adjustments until I had it fitting perfectly. And once it was, I could add a little bit of glue around the rabbet, drop it in place, and clamp it up until it had dried. Next up was making the sides, and for that, I'm using half-lap joinery. So I put my dado stack in my table saw, I set up some stop blocks, and I hogged away a bunch of material on the ends of the pieces to make the lap joints. Once I had it confirmed that I had everything set up just right, I just went to town and I cut in all the half laps for the long pieces. And then I did the same for all the short pieces. Now each of the short pieces on the bottom and the top of the side frames get some grooves cut in for the slats that we're about to add. Then I did the same thing for the two center pieces where the grooves are much closer together. And to make sure the spacing was identical, I just bound the pieces together and I cut them all at once, flipping and rotating the pieces after each pass. At this point, the frames were ready to go together. So I add some glue and I used my mallet of persuasion along with some squeezing to make sure that all the joints are closed up nicely. Then I just added on some clamps and I set them off to dry. Then I can add a subtle round over at the router table to the inside and the outside of each of the frames. And then it's time to cut all the thin strips that will end up going on the inside of these things. Now I've been saving this chunk of curly maple for years, just waiting for the right project to use it on, and I think this will be a perfect one. I cut up a bunch of strips that were the same thickness as my saw blade, and then I trimmed them down to about 3/4 of an inch wide. I bunched them all together, and I gave one of the ends a clean cut over at the miter saw. Then from there, I could start to drop them into place and to mark where they needed to be trimmed to fit. Now the center ones were just straight shots, so they were easy, but the other ones needed to be bent a bit so that they would fit into the grooves. I flexed them until I had the curve looking just right, and then I marked where they needed to be trimmed. Admittedly, I was a bit nervous about this glue up, but it was actually pretty easy. I just spread some glue within the cuts, and then I started with the center strip and moved on to the rest. I had to give some of them some taparoos to get them to go home, which inspired me to write and perform my brand new hit single entitled Sending 'Em Home. Now since I'm an amazing woodworker, I had some gaps to fill, and to address that, I made some little pointy bits from the leftovers and I jammed them into the holes. From there, I could just flush trim off the rest, sand things flush, and nobody will ever know. At this point, I realized I totally forgot to add the pieces on the sides that'll hold the dowel rod for hanging pants. Luckily, I was still able to get that in there. Then, speaking of the dowel, it was time to make that over at the router table. I just started with some square stock and then I rounded over each of the edges. Next thing was to make the hanger mount that comes out of the back of the drawer cabinet. Once I had it cut, I could draw on a radius and remove the corners over at the disc sander so that it would resemble a walnut Twinkie. Now for the coat hanger, I needed to first cut in a dado down the center of the board. I'm doing this now because it would be very difficult and awkward to do it after I have the shape cut out. I used my scissor and tape skills to cut out and piece together a scale drawing I made for the hanger piece. Then with some spray adhesive, I could center it and stick it down onto the board that just got the dado cut into the backside. At the bandsaw, I could cut it out, staying just outside the line. And then I can remove all the rough blade marks and sneak up to the line over at the belt sander. Now, since the hanger is slightly curved, I had to chisel out the edges of the rabbet on the mount just a bit so that it would fit without creating some big gaps. And next, I could fasten the hanger onto the vertical mount. And then I could give the whole piece a round over to soften the edges. After that, I glued on the other part of the mount, and then it was all ready to be mounted onto the back of the drawer cabinet. And to do that, I just drilled a hole in the center of the back, and another in the center of the mount. From there, I drove a screw through from the inside so that the tip was just barely protruding out. I lined up the two pieces, checked that they were square, and I left them to dry. Then once it had, I could drive the screw in the rest of the way to add even more support. Remember that tray I mentioned earlier? Well, I decided to use my CNC to carve some pockets into it that my wife can use for jewelry or for other little things. And once the robot was done doing its thing, I took it over to the router table and I added a subtle round over to the edges. Lastly, I could burn in my logo onto the underside so that years from now, long after I'm dead and gone, some stranger will look at this and know that I possess the knowledge and the skill to press the start button on a CNC machine. Now it's assembly time. I position the drawer cabinet upside down on my bench with the hanger piece over the edge. Then, with the help of some spacers, I could spread some glue onto the sides and clamp them into position. I also took this time to fish in the dowel rod through the holes in the sides, and then to get it glued in place. Once the assembly dried, I flipped it over, and I added some glue on the bottom edges of the sides. Then, just like a dubstep song, I dropped the bass into position. That was an awful joke. Sorry. Last thing was to flush trim off the dowel ends and give everything a good sanding. Now we're ready for finish. For that, I'll be using this tung oil and solvent from Bumbleshoots. Basically, if you mix it at a 1-to-1 ratio, you'll thin the oil so that it can really penetrate deep into the wood. Then after it's had some time to cure, you can follow it up with more coats to add even more protection. It's super easy to apply, and you can't really overdo it. Just brush it on, wait like 15 minutes or so, and wipe off any excess. Then the following day, just add more where you think it needs it. And if the piece starts to show signs of wear in the years down the road, all you have to do is add more to make it as good as new again. And Bumbleshoots is an affiliate of mine, so if you use the promo code FISHER10, you can save 10% on their products when you purchase stuff from Bumbleshoots.com. Just check out that figure. My goodness, that's amazing. And the contrast in the finger joints along with that round over really turned out awesome. And I wasn't expecting the curls in the maple to be that vibrant after the finish went on, so that was a nice surprise. The bent slats were a fun new challenge for me, and they really added a bunch of character and elegance to the sides. Overall, I am absolutely thrilled with how this all turned out. It might just be the prettiest thing I have ever made. Well, let's haul it upstairs and put it in place. The good news is that the wife absolutely loves it. Personally, I just grab the first thing I can find off the floor, and if I don't start dry heaving when I give it a sniff, then that's what I wear for the day. But she likes to put a little bit more thought and care into her appearance, and this gives her a way to lay it all out and to prepare so that she's all set for the next morning. And besides being useful, it's just a beautiful piece of furniture. If you'd like to try making this for yourself, or if you'd like to build some of the cool table saw jigs that I have in my shop, I have very detailed step-by-step instructions for them over on my website at fishersshoponline.com. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time. It's not in. Whoops. Why does that not look right? 2.5. What's half of 2.5 is not 1.5, idiots. Oh no. Oh no, I have a loose tooth. Be strong, little tooth. Okay. It just clamps them together. You idiot. Just this fun. Oh, crap. Mark this. Every tool's a hammer. Good. Oh. My dog thought somebody was knocking at the door. Oh yeah. Just pour it all over your bench. Yeah. Perfect. Oh, are you kidding me? Krepskis. The bottom is just a touch too long, and I gotta trim it. I can't get it out of there. Oh man. Holy crap. This is not good. Oh, there it goes. Holy crap. Okay, trim it just a little bit. Hurry before the glue dries.